Thank you so much, Vincent. And thank you so much for inviting me. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, besides being super important. So being important and really enjoying talking about is a good combination. Thank you so much for logging on and listening today, and happy Pride Month. As a clinical psychologist, this is definitely a topic that I get a lot of questions about, that I get to talk about a lot, both with patients, with parents, but really increasingly as part of professional development efforts. I do a lot of work with schools, medical departments, clinical programs, sort of mental health professionals. And I think there's certainly a lot of work to be done, as we'll talk about over the next bit of time here. But at the outset, I do want to say that I do feel optimistic about sort of the growing awareness that this is an important topic, and we do need to be talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, specifically in autism, and that there's a good building of resources that we're seeing related to these topics. So I think there's sort of cause for optimism, which is promising, I think, to me. So without further ado, let's talk about why you're all here. I'm going to start with a brief thank you, because I do sometimes feel like it gets squished towards the end. First is to our participants. I'll be talking about the results of the study that we've run. First round of in the fall. We're opening up a second round the upcoming end of summer, beginning of fall. And then our research team, which is made of a really good group of undergraduates and graduate students all across the neurodiversity spectrum, for helping to run these studies. And then, as Vincent mentioned, our community advisory board. And I want to highlight this group because this is a group that very kindly comes, we have dinner, we sit down, we go through our research protocols, we talk about what we're working on, how we could improve those projects, and what areas we're really missing. And that is a really huge part of our research program and how we develop these ideas. And I think that's really important to share the effort that team has put in with giving us feedback on our work that's made up of stakeholders like self-advocates, parents, educators, teachers, and it's also a lot of fun. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the gender unicorn. If you have not met the gender unicorn, get excited. If you've already met the gender unicorn, then a little review will kick off just to get some terms in place. We'll touch specifically on gender identity and sexual orientation and sort of what there is to know within autism specifically. We'll talk about sexuality and relationship education. That's my other favorite thing to talk about. I'll share a little bit of the data from our first round of data collection from that study I just mentioned. And then I'll leave you with some action steps and resources, which is usually the part that people are really here for anyway. So we'll make sure that we spend some good time on those two steps. And then I'll save some time for questions at the end. So feel free to type those in the chat. And Vincent will help curate those for me. So let's get started by getting everyone on the same page with some terms. This is oftentimes a question that I get from people trying to lead these discussions, like I don't want to say the wrong thing and there's so many terms. So let's break it down just to make sure we're all approaching this in the same way, okay? Let's see if you can see my mouse over here. I think you can. So gender identity and gender expression are up at the top, all right? So this refers to your gender and how you think about yourself. So gender identity, as you can see from the rainbow and the little thought bubble here, is how your internal sense of gender, how you think about your gender, okay? Compared to your gender expression, which are those green dots that go around the outside of the unicorn, that is how you sort of present your gender. And if you'll notice under each of these headings, there are 3 arrows. So for gender identity, there's female, woman, girl, then male, man, boy, and then other genders, okay? So for your gender identity, you can be any sort of level along each of those 3 lines, essentially. So you could feel somewhere like sometimes female, sometimes male. You could feel that you're an other gender, sort of a non-binary space that doesn't fall into those sort of prescribed buckets of being a girl or a boy. And that might be similar to your gender expression, but it also might not be, right? So that's where we find our gender identity terms. And then below that, we have sex assigned at birth. And so you see the little DNA strand hanging over sort of the genital area. So this is oftentimes when a baby is born and they pop out and the doctor notices they have a penis or they have vulva. Hey, you have a girl or a boy, right? So that's what we consider sort of sex assigned at birth. Oftentimes, this is consistent with the chromosomes that you have, right? So an XY chromosome pair or an XX chromosome pair. However, and this is always, I think, a fact that people find a bit interesting. At least 5% of pregnancies have some sort of chromosomal combination other than that, right? So either people have one of the chromosomes that you're expecting, your sex chromosomes, or they have more than two. All right, so that's 5 out of 100 people. So when we talk about sex assigned at birth, it's not quite as rigid a binary as we might have thought of initially. And sometimes people can go through their lives and not realize that they have just one or two, or more than the two chromosomes. But sometimes this comes up in other ways when people are going through puberty. But just to be aware that sex assigned at birth is still not as clear a message as I think sometimes we are taught. Down at the bottom, physically attracted and emotionally attracted to, these are sexual orientation terms, okay? Oftentimes, and including in this talk, gender identity and sexual orientation get clumped together, but they're not really referring to the same things, right? Sexual orientation is who we like, right? So who we might be sexually attracted to. On this chart, it breaks it down into physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to, right over the heart, which I think is very sweet. And then you can certainly be at different levels on all of these. Like if you are only attracted to women physically and emotionally, you might be all on those lines. If you're bisexual, it might be split. If it's the gender of the person isn't particularly the part that like builds your attraction, you might be on a different part of the spectrum. And then also when we're talking about asexuality, if you're just attraction to other people sexually, physically, emotionally is low, you might just be low across all of those arrows. Okay? What I like about this tool is that obviously there's a lot of complexities around identity and how identity shifts over time and how we understand and recognize our own identity sort of in the context of a culture. But that it is a good thing to have up and posted, right? So if you're a provider, have this in your office, have it up on your fridge at home. If you've got kids, have it up in your classroom. Because if someone has a question, then you've got some terms you can use. And it really exposes kids from an early age this idea that there are a lot of different ways to think about gender and sexual orientation. And it can be a good way to talk about, or I guess have a larger conversation about how we have these stereotyped gender roles and how that even though we're sort of raised in this society that really reinforces those, there might be some other ways to think about sexual orientation and gender. The other thing that I really like about this tool is that a quick Google brings us up in all sorts of languages, right? So if you are working with a community where you need a bunch of different languages ready to go at your fingertips, that already exist for you on the internet. And we'll talk about some limits to the internet in a little bit, but they are out there. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit to gender identity and autism specifically. This is a topic which is certainly studied in the US, but a lot of the information we have that's relevant to autism in particular, we get from the Netherlands and from Australia. They have sort of bigger data sets over there, and there's a couple of research groups that are really have some excellent work sort of constantly coming out of them. So I'll introduce you to some of their results to sort of set the stage. But definitely I would encourage you to go sort of look up some of these names afterward. And on the last page of my last slide, I do have the references. So when the slides are posted, you can take a look and do some exploring yourself. So on this chart, across the top, you see assigned gender, assigned sex at birth. So male and female. And down on the left, you see how adults with autism are identifying now. So they feel male. This is their gender identity, partly male, partly female, not male or female, don't know, different, feels female, okay? So what we're finding is that about 92% of autistic men in the Netherlands in this study say that they also feel like they are a man. Their gender identity is also male, sort of consistent with their sex assigned at birth. And then for females, we see down on the bottom line that about 78% of females feel that their gender identity is also female, okay? These rates are significantly different from what we see in the neurotypical population. With this particular study for gender identity, they didn't have an exact comparison group, but let me give you a few numbers to sort of help give you some context. So they did a recent study, I think this was just in 2018, that showed almost 3% of adolescents, and this I think was completed in Minnesota, identify as transgender or gender non-conforming, right? So that essentially not being female and feeling like female is also your gender identity. which is a lot different than what we're seeing here. So that would suggest that 97% of females also feel female, and 97% of males also feel male. So what we're noticing is that not necessarily that there are more males that think their gender identity is that they're a woman, but that it's something other than the same gender identity and their sex assigned at birth, which is the term we use for that is cisgendered, when those sort of align with each other. So right here we know that, okay, there's something that seems to be a little bit different for the autistic community that we should be aware of. On the flip side, they've done some interesting studies where they'll go into gender dysphoria clinics. So these are clinics where people are experiencing a lot of stress about sort of this mismatch between the sex they were assigned at birth and their gender identity. And in those groups, we're seeing higher rates of autistic traits as well. So there's something here that's been identified sort of over and over again in studies that's good for us to be aware of. Okay. With sexual orientation, they actually did have a comparison group, so we can look a little bit more directly. So looking at whether people were autistic or neurotypical, asking, okay, who do you feel attracted to? And I'm not going to go through this whole chart because it's a lot of numbers, but the things that I'm going to highlight are the little sections with stars. I'm going to cherry pick a little bit here. So of the autistic men, almost 82% said I'm attracted to women only, right? That is it. For the neurotypical group, a little over 90% said that. So there was a difference, right? There were more people, more men with autism reporting sort of other sexual orientations other than heterosexual. And for women, we saw that difference was even greater, right? So almost 50% of women said they were attracted to men only versus 87% of neurotypical adults being attracted to men early. And then, so those women were falling sort of in other buckets. So that this heterosexual framework for a relationship, we don't see it quite as often in autism, okay? We don't know why that is. We haven't done a lot to sort of dig into that. I think that might be really interesting, but I think what I will highlight in the next few slides is that we do have some work to do and some gaps to address, because there is a certain amount of preparation for relationships that we would like to think we're including in our curriculum and training that we are not. And it's particularly important to know that this is a population that needs that information, because these are the relationships and gender identities that they are experiencing. I will just highlight, because I just think this is particularly interesting, is that more women, if you notice the rates, more women generally identify as a sexual orientation other than heterosexual, and that is true across autistic and neurotypical populations. So with women in particular, this is a good thing to be aware of. How we talk about and teach the concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation is particularly critical for autistic learners. And you're logged on, so I'm assuming you probably already know this. And if you don't, by the time we get to the end of the hour, I'm hoping you will be convinced. We just touched upon the fact that these concepts impact this population more than the neurotypical population, right? So obviously for that reason, it's particularly critical. Second is really teaching about these concepts, sexual orientation and gender identity is not a mainstream component of sex education in this country. So for most of the sex ed pieces today, I'm going to be talking about what we're doing or not doing in the US. And that's a problem. That's something that we need to address. And we'll go through a couple of action steps to help with that. And then third is really how we talk about gender identity, gender and sexual orientation broadly. It tends to be a very rigid representation. We rely a lot on gender stereotypes. And if you are a learner who really likes things to have clear categories, like some autistic learners are, this idea of sort of non-binary identities or flexibility in identities could be challenging to teach, and we don't have a lot of good guidance on how to do that, especially if these really rigid roles are ingrained in society, and like which toys were sold versus if you're a girl or a boy, or which activities you're supposed to be doing. And I've gotten questions before when we're talking about gender identity. I had a young woman who said, well, I really like math and I really like sports. So does that mean that I am a boy, that my gender identity is a boy, right? So parsing out what these different pieces and messages mean can be very interesting, but a new challenge. And then on the other hand, I've had adults who are certainly aware that coming out as gay to their family may come with some social stigma. Coming out of a closet could be a big moment, and there could be some challenge to that, but they feel less concerned with some of that stigma, or less of that push to conform to quote unquote gender norms. And so in that way, they find it really freeing. So I think there's a whole range of experiences that people can have. There's a lot of room for research and sort of clinical discussions about this, but that it's really important that we think about these issues as parents, as providers, as individuals on the spectrum. Another reason, right? I'm a clinical psychologist, so obviously there was going to be just a dash of mental health information thrown in here. Another reason this is important is because how mental health outcomes impact autistic individuals, and then autistic individuals who have sort of non-heterosexual identities or non-cisgendered identities is really critical. So there's a lot of lines on this chart, but really what this is saying is personal well-being, stress, depression, and anxiety, and they measured each of these for autistic non-heterosexual, and that is just a term to say gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, autistic heterosexual, neurotypical non-heterosexual, and neurotypical heterosexual. So what we find in these, and no surprise to those of you in the SPARC community, is that things like stress, depression, anxiety are higher for autistic folks, okay? And this is in a study of adults. For sexual orientation, there wasn't a huge difference for autistic individuals who were heterosexual or had some sort of other identity, but there was a difference for the called gender dysphoria traits. So these are differences between your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity. So that autistic folks who were experiencing a gender identity that was different than their sex at birth were increasingly impacted by stress, depression, and anxiety, and had lower ratings of personal well-being to a significant level. Okay, so that not only are autistic folks, identifying with these identities more commonly than the neurotypical peers, but when they do, they're experiencing more negative mental health correlates with them. And so we really need to make sure we're providing good resources, because we already know that depression, anxiety, and stress is really hard and high for autistic adults. And so this is just really a flag to us, I think, to be paying attention, right? That there's a lot of support that can be provided here. Which brings me to my other favorite soapbox, right? Sexuality and relationship education. You did register for this webinar, so you probably knew this was coming. But sexuality and relationship education, in the US at least, the structure can be really frustrating. For many school-based programs, there's sometimes a day for the sex talk. Some schools have long as a semester, some have long as a year, but it's really shockingly brief, right? If we think about other lifelong academic skills, things like reading, right? You learn your letters, you learn what they look like, you learn their sounds, then you build those into words, you put words into sentences, and then you learn how to write essays and PowerPoint presentations and things like that, right? And that is a lifetime skill that requires building on these smaller blocks. It's really the same for sexuality and relationship education. We have this stereotype that it is this one time, oh, you learn about STIs and how to prevent pregnancy when you're young. But there's so much more to it. Think about something like consent, right? That is a huge, important topic in sexuality and relationship education, in autism and outside, right? For anyone, especially as you've been watching the news cycle the past few years. But if you all of a sudden drop the idea of consent and how to navigate consent into the lap of a teenager who's also navigating hormones and maybe wanting to be in a relationship or being nervous about being in a relationship, and you haven't had those discussions leading up about boundaries, how to give consent in friendships over little things, what are power dynamics, what does it mean to feel safe, then that's not going to make a lot of sense. It's not really going to stick, right? And you've missed out on a really huge teaching opportunity. So how does this relate to sex and gender? I would argue that it's really the same thing, right? You need to start small. You need to start introducing kids to concepts when they're young. So then when they start to think about their own identity, they're a little bit prepared, right? They know sort of what's going on. So where are we now? Let me give you a little sort of lay of the land here. In the US, there's huge variation by state, and then even beyond that by school, okay? I want you to think for a second about what should be covered in sex ed, right? This is a big topic. People have a lot of different opinions on it. What are some topics, if you can think to yourself for a couple seconds, that you think would be really important to include in any sort of sex ed experience? My guess is that many of you touched on things like anatomy and physiology, right? Like body parts, what is going on? When is puberty happening? Sexual health, so a lot of, STIs, puberty and adolescent sexual development, so how your body changes. And then there are a couple of other areas that that are in the national sex ed standards that I think are really important, but sometimes get overlooked and are pretty relevant here. Gender identity and expression is right in there. Sexual orientation and identity is also in there. Consent and healthy relationships, and interpersonal violence. And the reason I highlight those four in particular is because those have a lot of social components in them, right? And that is something that can be sort of more challenging to cover, be sure that you cover when you're working with autistic learners. Another limitation that we have is the research tools to study these. So some tools are outdated, especially when we think about gender identity and sexual orientation. Our understanding of these concepts has come a really long way in recent years, but then it can be sort of hard to build on previous work because you don't want to use the same phrasing that was used before, or that people don't really want to share this information, right? They're afraid if they participate in a study, that information will get out, and that can be really uncomfortable if they haven't come out to people, in their family or in their community. So that can be a limitation even for participating. And really, relevance to today's talk, that sex ed programs in the US are geared toward heterosexual relationships, so a man and a woman, between cisgendered people, so people whose sex assigned at birth is the same as their gender identity. Okay? And we just saw that that's not as often the case in autism. And this is true for over 90% of the sex ed programs in the US currently, okay? So that's not great. And then variable access for autistic learners. And this is something that we've heard sort of over and over again, that for some, school-based programs, students might be included in the sex ed program, but they might not have some of the learning adaptations that are available to them in other classes. Some might not be involved at all. So there's a lot of room for improvement here about how we address access to sex ed for autistic students. So what do we need to know? How could we then improve upon these, right? Now that I've gone and highlighted all of the issues that we have. Our teaching methods. I won't go into this too much because this could be a whole sort of semester-long course in and of itself, but there's a lot of innuendo when discussing sexuality, right? A lot of things are left unsaid. We use words that sort of skip around, and that social communication piece is missed. A good example I like to think of here is when you think about sex education, sometimes the classic example that comes to mind is like putting a condom on a banana, right? And certainly that is an important part of sexual health for sure. But really at its core, that's a motor task, right? And if you think about that, in order to have gotten to that point in a relationship, right, you've had to identify someone that you might even need to use a condom with, that you might want to have a romantic relationship or sort of experience with. You've had to flirt with them. You've had to get them to call or text you back, or like you back on Tinder. And then you've had to have that conversation about, okay, who's getting the condom? Are we using a condom? Why are we doing this? What does it mean for us to be having sex? There's so many social pieces that come before that, where if you know how to put a condom on, that's really maybe not the most useful part of that interaction to have to navigate. Sources of information, right? So how do we promote getting information from high quality sources? So remember I mentioned the internet, we'll get into that. That can be great. It can also give us some bad information, right? So how do we make sure that we are coaxing people to get information from good quality places? Timing is a super interesting question about gender identity and sexual orientation in autism in particular. First of all, sex education in the US is generally a bit too late, right? Most sexually active teens get their first sex talk at school after they've had intercourse for the first time, which isn't great. So generally we need to move that whole timeline forward. But beyond things like sexual behaviors and puberty, when we have a couple of rough estimates for, things like figuring out your identity and thinking through like how you might tell people about your identity, or how you would even figure out what your identity is, which is a big question I get in sex ed groups, is how do these processes start? Are they the same for autistic adolescents and children as they are for neurotypical adolescents and children? And that we really don't know. We know from research with neurotypical kids that there's an awareness of gender before the age of 2, and that kids are pretty clear on their own assigned gender and the characteristics that are associated by that. by the time they're 3. So this starts very, very young. That's also when they're really aware of physical differences. So they might be sort of playing doctor with their friends, might be really interested in their own genitalia. And then they're in this cognitive stage where they really like categories. So they have this really rigid interpretation of girl stuff and boy stuff until they're about 6. Okay, so those are really firmly in place. So is that the same in autism? Is that the timeline exactly the same? If someone's developmental age is sort of closer to a 5 or 6-year-old, does that include that sort of interpretation of gender, or does that something that shifts? In terms of sexual orientation, we know that regardless of identity in neurotypical populations, individuals retroactively report their sort of first sexual attraction around the age of 9 or 10, okay? And that coincides with like things like the adrenal gland are maturing, there's an increase in testosterone and things like that. So it sort of makes sense medically why that would be happening. And that depending on the culture, kids with orientations other than heterosexual generally go through sort of a questioning period where they are processing their attraction to others, figuring out what it means to them, thinking about how that balances with cultural norms. And is that process the same in autism? And we really don't know that. We haven't done much work on that at all. And then obviously we need to know what would happen if we did have sex ed, which was inclusive of all identities, right? I think this would be obviously great for people on the spectrum, but also generally, if over 90% of our programming is geared toward people who are heterosexual and cisgendered, we're missing a lot of kids and adolescents. And so, you know, if we were to meet those needs, how would that benefit the community? So we're digging into some of these questions with work that we're doing in my research lab. So we're doing an online anonymous study to sort of get at that, you know, if people weren't that comfortable sharing. And we're asking both autistic and neurotypical adults a whole bunch of questions about their sex ed experiences. What did you learn? When did you learn? When would you like to learn about certain topics? Relationship and identity experiences. So similar, like when were you first attracted to someone else? When did you first think about your gender identity? And then some sort of commonly associated traits. So things like anxiety, depression, repetitive behaviors, to see how all of these factors are related to each other. So for our first round that we completed in the fall, we had 88 neurotypical adults and 44 autistic adults. And then we'll be opening up at the end of summer to get another round of folks in. And here's what we found. I'm just going to highlight the findings that were relevant to the sort of gender identity and sexual orientation questions. And we're still digging through the rest of the data, which has been a lot of fun. So the first piece I want to share with you is timing, right? I was just like, when do we teach about these things? So to start, we asked, okay, when did you first think about gender identity from your memory? And when did you first think about sexual orientation? And what we found is that there was no difference in the self-report between the autistic adults and the neurotypical adults. The majority of people reported first thinking about either of these between the ages of 13 and 17. For gender identity, about 10% said it first sort of occurred to them between the ages of 6 and 12. And then for sexual orientation, about 21% said they first started thinking about sexual orientation between the ages of 6 and 12. So no difference, those are the same. So whatever timeline we're teaching that on, I think we should move it earlier generally, right? If you've got a fifth of kids thinking about this between the ages of 6 and 12, you know, an 8th grade presentation on it is going to be too late and really not as helpful. We also asked about sources of information. So where are people getting information? Where are kids getting information about all sorts of different sex ed topics, but specifically about gender identity and sexual orientation? And then we compared those between our autistic adults and our neurotypical adults, and there were no differences again. So people are using the same resources, which is good news, sort of. It may not be a huge surprise, but the internet was the biggest source of information for both topics, right? And we did break that down to ask about, you know, what are sort of quality, you know, respected websites, things like .org websites, right? Planned Parenthood, GLAAD, things like that. And about 77% of people said that they were using sites like that gave good information, but over 65% said that they were also getting information from websites of unknown quality, right? So sort of unverifiable, which isn't great. So some sort of media awareness and literacy campaign, I think, is something we really should start thinking about in tandem with sex ed, especially as people are thinking through their identities. These are big questions. You want to make sure they are relying on good information. The third biggest source of information after quality website and unknown quality website was similar age peers. So friends within 2 years of the age of the participant was the next biggest source of information about sexual orientation and gender identity. And then a couple of numbers which I found a little less positive. Parents accounted for 16% of where people were getting information for gender identity and 11% for sexual orientation. And then way down at the bottom, we had 11% of respondents reported getting information on these topics from care providers. So people like me, like psychologists and doctors, which I think is a real big call to make sure that we are asking those questions as providers, because that should be a really great place to get information that we know is sort of safe and reliable. We also asked folks across a range of sex ed topics, okay, what do you wish you had more information about? And this is where we did see a couple of differences. Significantly more often, the autistic adults said, sexual orientation and gender identity are topics I want more information about. It was not as common in the neurotypical group. So we're literally hearing from them now to sort of add to our list of why this is so critical. This is something I want to hear more about, which is good, right? So it's good you're at this talk. You're already addressing this need. And we also asked all the participants to compare their level of knowledge across a bunch of sex ed topics to their peers. So do you think you know the same amount, more, less, a little less than your peers across sexual orientation and gender identity, for example? And then we looked to see how this was related to the autism quotient 10, which is a brief measure of self-report of autistic symptoms. And we found there was no relationship with that either, right? So that people's perception of how much their peers know was not that impacted by whether or not they had autism. So they're like, okay, I think these are sort of similar, right? My peers know just as much or just as little as I do, regardless of whether or not I'm on the spectrum. Okay. So let me just summarize a couple of those big points and take homes that I want you to remember. So gender identity diversity, right, and queer sexual orientations, so non-heterosexual orientations, occur more often in autistic populations than neurotypical populations. Then there's less access to sexuality and relationship education for autistic students. And then finally, that these programs in schools overwhelmingly do not include information that's relevant for the LGBTQ+ individuals, which we know impacts the autistic group more than others. And this is where I get to introduce you to one of my favorite television characters. This is Eric. If you have not had the pleasure of watching Sex Education on Netflix, I would highly recommend. His facial expressions are incredible, but what, right? So we know there's this huge gap here that needs to be addressed. This show was not autism focused, but I really just thought he captured my reaction to the cluster of findings there. So what can we do about it? And I think this is really the big meat and potatoes of why you're probably here today. And I've broken this down into different groups. So we'll talk about parents, sort of other adults in children's lives, schools, and then some experiences to make sure that you're talking about. So first, for parents, like we said, start this early, right? Start talking about sexual orientation and gender identity right away. I teach a sexuality and gender course at Tufts. I'm in a child study and human development department, which means we get to spend a whole day looking at kids' books, right? And I can certainly send out a list of these as well. I was able to snag some from my office before we closed, but there's a whole bunch that they have that are geared towards little kids. Tango Makes Three, Red, and these are sort of picture books, but there's also little board books. C is for Consent is a really good one. And I have more recommendations here in case you are interested in those. But making sure that you are sort of offering and have available books and media with really diverse family structures and characters with various gender identities. And you have to be pretty mindful about this. This isn't a library that's sort of going to curate itself, right? You have to dig a little bit, but there's a lot of good reading lists out there now that parents have found really helpful. And then using wording like many or some when discussing gender and sex, right? So instead of all boys have penises, be like many boys have penises or some boys have penises, because that gives you an opportunity to sort of discuss other gender identities and how, genitalia might be different than someone's gender identity and why that might be. And then finally, reading up and identifying areas of discomfort. And this is really a big one. For school-based education, sex education, the biggest predictor of what you're taught is teacher comfort and then the resources that the school has available, okay? For parents teaching sex ed, it tends to be how we learn sex ed, okay? And you can, certainly think back on your own experience, like how was gender identity discussed in your family? How was sexual orientation discussed in your family? And for many folks, it just wasn't, right? And maybe for some of you it was, which would be great. But if it wasn't, then jumping into those conversations might be hard. And so doing a little bit of prep work can be really helpful. Experts do recommend, especially for autistic kids and adolescents, that parents are really the most recommended source of sexuality and relationship education, which I think a lot of parents would agree with. And they've done some really interesting studies about parent comfort with this. So Holmes and Himmel did a really cool research study a few years ago, and they asked parents, okay, what have you already told your teen about, and what have you not told your teen about? And what we're finding is that parents tend to avoid topics that they feel less comfortable with, which makes sense, but that leaves kids to get information from less credible sources, which we don't want. So in this particular study by Holmes that I mentioned, for teens on the spectrum with average or above average IQ, most parents covered topics at home about things like privacy, puberty, sexual abuse prevention. They did talk about family types and roles, sort of like basic relationships would sort of get to that sexual orientation piece. But they skipped things like more relationship relevant questions, right? So general sexuality, so things other than intercourse, which tends to be pretty relevant for adolescent learners. And then for parents of kids who had below average IQ, similar patterns. So really focusing on privacy, sexual abuse prevention, puberty, which are super important, but then not really talking about things like relationships, sexuality, and things like that. And then on the resource page, there will be a couple of links and books and things that could be particularly useful for parents that would be good to check out. So other adults, this is my catch-all phrase for doctors or any sort of medical professionals, OTs, SLPs, psychologists, social workers, et cetera, et cetera. So other adults who are sort of coming in contact with autistic learners. The first is just to ask questions, right? So ask about gender identity and sexual orientation. If it's not a typical part of your form on the intake process, if you're at a practice, change that. Leave a line for pronouns, right? Make it sort of a part of your practice so that kids, if they want to share or if they have a question about something, the structure is already there. That sort of removes one barrier to them asking questions. Having resources in your office and your waiting room. So just have the stuff around, right? Teens don't necessarily want to jump right in and ask you questions about sex ed. That's maybe you've had different experiences, even as a sex educator, that has not been mine. Sometimes you got to sort of be like, let's talk about it anyway, even though it makes us uncomfortable. But if you've got a book about gender on your bookshelf, or you've got the gender unicorn sort of laminated hanging on your door, that certainly opens the door and sends a good signal that you're ready for that conversation. Considering developmental age. So this can be a really tricky one. When we're talking about sexual maturation, things like, going through puberty, those age sort of timelines don't differ that much between autistic and neurotypical populations. With a lot of families that I work with, they're like, okay, well, my son has the body of a 17-year-old, but developmentally he's closer to a 9 or 10-year-old. So should I teach to the 17-year-old body that he is, or the 9 or 10-year-old sort of understanding level that he's working on? First rule of thumb is we always teach people for the body they have, right? So if you're 17, you got to talk about and sort of work on 17-year-old related topics, things like masturbation, right? Privacy, boundaries, safety, that sort of stuff. And then appropriate ways to approach relationships as well. But there's also a really interesting chart in one of the books that I'll mention that talks about, okay, here are the developmental stages, and here are how you talk about topics, things like gender, right? So if you've got a kid who sort of thinks like a 5-year-old and they're in that very concrete, rigid, okay, here's girl stuff and boy stuff, how do you talk about gender identity with someone who's thinking like that? So rely on your resources for that and making sure you're sort of checking on both developmental age and chronological age. And then understanding family and community context. This is extra important for gender identity and sexual orientation in particular. I come at this from a very positive and sort of welcoming, like, oh, like, let's talk about it and talk about how you're feeling and process this together. That's not safe for all kids. So especially if you are a provider and you're not sure if this is something that would be safe for a child to share at home, that's good to assess for. In the homeless adolescent and young adult population in the US, a huge percentage of those kids are LGBTQ+, because they have been kicked out of their homes when they came out to their families or communities. So just to recognize that there could be risk there, and having conversations about how to come out, if you want to come out, who would be safe to come out to, especially if there's a lot of social nuance involved in that, could be really helpful to help a teen or a sort of a patient navigate. So what to do at schools, because this also comes up at schools, right? Identifying champions can be really good. Teachers are busy, okay, and especially after the spring that many of the schools around here have had, you're extra busy, sort of also balancing, your own kids, balancing work at home. And so I don't think this means that every teacher has to be a specialist in how to talk about sexual orientation and gender, but have a few people or know that there's someone that you can go to who has good information to provide to students. Working sexuality and relationship education into IEPs, so talking about gender identity, sexual orientation, consent, all of these things, getting that sort of documented is how we approach that right into kids' IEPs as early as you can as part of their sort of social and emotional learning. And then focusing on behaviors in addition to discussing identity. And this could really have gone into any of the three boxes so far. For some folks are like, oh, let's say, I'm a lesbian and I know what that means and I know who I'm attracted to, and that's a pretty clear-cut term for me. For some folks, either because of not wanting to be labeled or maybe there's a risk of being labeled, they might not want to use it. Let's say they don't want to use the term lesbian, but they will share with you that they have either romantic relationships or sexual experiences with other women, right? Focusing on behaviors instead of the identity still gets the point across about what you're trying to talk about. So if you are trying to talk about safe sexual behaviors and dental dams, for example, it doesn't matter if you're a lesbian or not for that, right? What matters is that you're using safe sexual methods when you are having a sexual experience with a woman, okay? And so sometimes focusing on behaviors can be a good way to get around if someone is resistant to using certain terms. And then supporting the Gay Straight Alliance or any sort of LGBTQ+ group at your school. There's another really good resource that talks about sexual orientation in the school setting, and the #1 way to reduce incidents of bullying is to have a group like this and to have a lot of support for it. So if there's not one, talk about getting one started. If there is one, is there a way that you can support that group? Or do they have a sign you can hang in your classroom? For many, many students, this is true, or many groups, this is true. And so definitely explore what resources already exist at your school or institution or wherever you are. And then just to highlight a couple of experiences, I think that cross across all of these, excuse me. First, keeping questions open-ended. I think this is a pretty general one, but instead of, do you like any boys at school, right? Is there anyone that you like at school? Keeping that really open, talking about examples of other people who, been in relationships with men or women or identify as non-binary. And then navigating the coming out process can be really challenging for neurotypical and autistic teens. It's a very socially heavy interaction. There's a lot of deciding who, deciding when, just being aware of that. But I think sort of offering, like, if you want to brainstorm, that can be really helpful if you, especially for sort of verbal teens who are working through next steps. And then also respecting and navigating if people don't want to come out, right? That is an okay decision to make as well. So the resource list, the big excitement that people are here for. Curricula, so this is not an exhaustive list, there are other ones out there. The Tackling Teenage Training Program was developed in the Netherlands. It is a one-on-one sex ed program that specifically covers sexual orientation and gender identity for autistic teens. This is not something that you can purchase, but we are going to be running an online version of this starting later this summer, and I'll tell you how to get in contact with us in case that is of interest. But when you're looking for curricula to, work with a teen or a younger person, making sure that there are sections that are on sexual orientation and gender identity to start sort of practicing that really early. Books, there's a whole bunch of books. One that I think is particularly helpful either for individuals to read themselves or for parents to read. It's called Sex, the All You Need to Know Sexuality Guide to Get You Through Your Teens and 20s. That is not autism specific, but really has a lot of good chapters on gender identity and sexual orientation, which is why I like to highlight it here. The Facts of Life and More is geared toward individuals with developmental disabilities broadly. And this is really more for parents or providers. I don't know if it would be as helpful for someone on the spectrum to read, although it might be, but it's geared toward folks who might have sort of below average IQ and whose developmental level needs to be sort of factored into how you're teaching about these different topics. And then A Guide to Gender, I like really accessible book to read. It's got a little all gender restroom sign on the back that you can use if you're in a place where you're able to shift something to an all gender bathroom. And then the book that I mentioned, I think last slide, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity in Schooling, talks specifically about how to support and sort of promote support of kids with different sexual orientations and gender identities in school settings. It also has an international lens, which is good. A couple of online quality resources, I should add that term in there. If you have not yet explored Sex Ed for Self-Advocates through the Organization for Autism Research site, go Google it. It's very cool. It was developed with self-advocates, which I think is extra important. There are videos, there are different sections that you can navigate to. So I always send people there, always. GLAD is specifically geared towards sort of gay and lesbian resources. It's a very high quality site where you can get good information. There's definitions of terms. So if you're sort of starting to explore this process and wanting more information, that can be a good jumping off point. And then Planned Parenthood has a number of videos and sort of educational resources. There are some that are specifically geared, I think, towards developmental disabilities more broadly, but honestly, they have a series of videos for their consent process, which I use in my groups all of the time. They show all sorts of different gender identities and relationship constellations, and it really goes through, okay, what do you say in different situations to express consent, to ask for consent? And I really think it's just designed perfectly for someone with autism, right? So it really lays out those social communication steps. And then the last three here, television shows. And I'm not saying that this should replace sex education or information about sexual orientation or gender identity, but these can be really good places to start conversations, especially for parents. If you're like, I think my child might want to talk about this, I don't know how much they know, how can we bring this up? These can be a really good bridge. Sex education does not have any autistic characters or identified autistic characters in it, but you will see a whole range of gender identities and sexual orientations in there, and that's really for a teen audience. And that's on Netflix. Everything's Gonna Be Okay. Really heartwarming show. This has the benefit of having a main character who is not only plays a autistic woman, but she's an autistic actress herself. So that's very cool. And there's a lot of discussions about relationships in there. And then Atypical has been around for a little bit longer. That's on Netflix. That is about, again, a teenage boy who's on the spectrum. He's starting to be interested in romantic relationships. I'll take a quick second, a brief little interesting history about Atypical if you haven't seen it before. The first season they had on Netflix got a little bit or a fair amount of pushback, especially from self-advocates, because they did not really integrate autistic voices at all as they should have. And this was a group that took a pause, brought autistic people into sort of the production process. They now employ autistic actors as part of the show, and they've done a really good job of sort of addressing some of the concerns that the community had about this show. I will say that it does fall a little bit into that box of shows about sort of that Asperger profile, upper class, white boy, navigating relationships. So that is a little bit of a sort of downfall with that one. But those are three really good places to start that talk about sex education right in them. And then for me, oftentimes people have sort of questions or are interested in studies in this area, or doing research themselves would be interested in collaborating. It's a small community, so definitely reach out if you're interested. Really the best way to keep in touch with us is we have accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and it's under Korean Lab. I got really creative with the name. And anytime we have a new study going around, we post on there. We post resources about sex ed. We post resources about books and self-advocates. And that is also, for better or for worse, because of COVID, All of our studies except for one are now online, so you don't have to live in the Boston area near us to participate in them. So keep an eye out for that. They're mainly geared toward teens and adults, and right now actually mostly towards adults. But yeah, if you are interested in those, give us a follow, and then when we post new study information, there's always contact info there. If you already know there's a study that you want to participate in, koreanlab@tufts.edu is right there for you to reach out to our team. And then if you have other questions about like trainings or resources and things like that, my email address is down there as well. Briefly, and then I'll open up for questions for a couple minutes. We actually are currently recruiting to build an advisory board. I'm collaborating on a project with a group at BU where we're looking at how we even think about how we design sex ed programs. So we're looking for autistic individuals between the ages of 16 and 25 who would be able to participate in 11 remote meetings per year. You would be paid for your time. You would be working with the advisory board is only about 3 to 5 people, so it would be small. But that is coming up. And then I have a couple of other projects over on the left side of your screen if you're interested. One on fitness, that's an online interview. Siblings, that's an online questionnaire. And then our sex ed study that's going to be online for teens and adults will be starting later this summer. And then a second round of that study that I mentioned, the results I mentioned a little bit earlier, we will be opening that up in a few months. So keep an eye out for that. And I can pause there. And if there are questions, I would be happy to hear them.
Thank you so much. We did get a few questions in. I think some of them were answered. Just to remind everyone, we will post the slides and a recording of this talk in the next few days, so that will go up. So let's see here. Someone has a question about how would you recommend talking to teens on the spectrum that identify as asexual or who may be uncomfortable even talking about sex?
Yes. Uncomfortable talking about sex, I feel like, is the most common thing. I talk about asexuality in the same way as we talk about any kind of sexuality, like whatever feels like it's a good fit for you right now. And it is totally fine and appropriate. And I also try and normalize it a little bit. Like, asexuality exists, right? Both in humans and in animals. There's a great, huge book. It's called Biological Exuberance. If you're ever interested, it talks about essentially like sexual orientation and different types of sexualities in the animal world, which I use oftentimes in my class. But yeah, so I try to normalize for sure. And then I still, and this is also true regardless of people's sexual orientation, I really am a strong believer that people should hear all of the information about all of the identities, because either you might get something out of it that you might not realize. You might have a friend or family member who has a different identity, and then you have some background, and things could shift over time, right? You know, if you're asexual, and then maybe you'll be asexual for the rest of your life. Or maybe right now someone's saying, oh, I'm asexual, but they're really anxious and they don't want to be in a relationship. That could shift later, which would be different than identifying as asexual. But yeah, so I would address it directly, normalize, and then still provide all the information just like any other sexual orientation.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned a bunch of resources, but do you have any that might be specific to adults with autism to guide on relationship education? Is there anything you'd recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would start with the Sex Ed for Self-Advocates. It says sex in it, but it is relationship focused for sure. In terms of written resources, I don't actually know anything off the top of my head that would be sort of like a self-guide book. Isabel Hinault has a really good book. It's called Intimacy and Asperger's Disorder, I think, like roughly the title. That talks about building relationships that isn't all sexuality focused. And then there's certainly some social skills programs which touch on building towards relationships. Like I know like the Peers program, the young adults version, has a couple of chapters on dating. Yeah.
Okay. Another one just came in about talking about non-binary identities. I know you showed the chart at the beginning. Yeah. Do you recommend anything else to talk about non-binary identities?
So that, I'll actually go back for a second because I think it's called the Trans Student Educational Resource. Yes, TSER. I would go to transstudent.org and there's also, I mean, it says trans student. It's not just for people who are transgender. It has a whole bunch of resources on there. So I would start there. There's a lot of cool stuff on this site. This is just one graphic that I usually pull.
Okay. What about someone that might have intellectual disability? So maybe it could affect understanding about things like this. The person specifically says masturbation. How would you recommend kind of broaching that topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those sorts of topics, a couple of things. One is I would pull on one of the resources, the Walker Hirsch book in particular, which maps some of the developmental stages onto behaviors. I found that hugely helpful. I think the second thing is to think about learning systems that have worked for your particular child or student before, and then apply them to masturbation. I think sometimes a little bit of a hit point can be like, oh, but it's about sex. So like, for example, with masturbation, if you've got someone who's pretty good at visuals, using like blue dots or stickers or something to mark spots where you can masturbate, right? You just can't say don't masturbate all the time because people masturbate. That's the thing, right? And so proactively and positively saying you can do it in here with the door closed if you're in your bedroom or wherever you've designated at home. And that way, if they start to do someplace else, you can either pick like a different color or shape to say, no, this is no masturbating here. But really making sure that you're pairing those, so which would probably be a similar teaching device that you're using in other areas.
Okay. We're coming up on 1 o'clock, but you are okay if people email you?
Yeah, for sure.
With additional questions? I know we didn't get to everything, so I do apologize, but really, thank you again